Hi, everyone. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today on Indigenous Peoples Day. While we're gathering together in this virtual space together, each of us are also situated in an actual place. And so I want to begin by acknowledging that I am currently on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band, who are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley community today. So before I introduce the speakers, I want to offer just a note about the Zoom protocols. So we're going to have time for questions and discussion. So we want to invite your participation, your questions, and you can put those questions and comments into the chat. You can also use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of the Zoom window, to leave questions that we will review during the discussion period. And there's also an option of you to ask audio questions by clicking the raise hand button, which is also down there at the bottom of the Zoom window. We highly encourage your participation, and we will look forward to the discussion. Please be aware that the event is being recorded, so if you are concerned about privacy, you might want to type your question as opposed to asking it on audio. So we're getting a question from an attendee about how long is allotted for today. We are allotting 1 hour to this event, so it will conclude at the top of the hour, if not sooner. Okay. So that's the Zoom protocols. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, who are the members of the organizing committee of the conference entitled Mass Violence and Its Lasting Impact on Indigenous Peoples, the Case of the Americas and Australia Pacific region. Before the pandemic, this conference was actually scheduled to begin today. It's now been postponed for a year so it can happen safely, and it will fall on Indigenous Peoples Day in 2021. We wanted to mark this day by coming together with the organizers, some of the presenters whose names I can see in the chat, and to share more about the conference. So one of the conference organizers couldn't be here today, so I want to start by acknowledging her. Irma Alicia Velasquez Nematu is a Maya Quiche journalist, activist, and visiting professor at the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford University, where she teaches courses on Indigenous resistance and contradictions in Latin America, Guatemala's Indigenous rights, and courses about Central and Latin American history and culture. Dr. Nimatu was the first Maya Quiche woman to earn a doctorate in social anthropology in Guatemala. The author of several books, she's part of a long line of struggle and resistance in her community since the Spanish invasion in 1524. And she has become an international spokeswoman for Indigenous communities in Central America. We regret that due to her teaching schedule, she can't join us today in this discussion, but she's fundamental to the planning of the conference. Moving on to the speakers who will be speaking today, I'll introduce them briefly. And because of time, these introductions are extremely brief. We encourage you to read their full profiles, which are available on the event website. And we'll put the link for the event website in the chat so you can read more about the speakers. Lorena Sekwan Fontaine is Cree Anishinaabe and a member of the Sagking First Nation in Manitoba, Canada. She is the Indigenous Academic Lead at the University of Winnipeg and an Associate Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies. Professor Fontaine has taught for the First Nations University of Canada and the School of Public Policy graduate program at Queen's University. She has spoken nationally and internationally and has authored articles on residential school issues and Indigenous language rights in Canada. Her dissertation research was presented in a CBC documentary entitled Undoing Linguicide. She has also worked with the Assembly of First Nations as an advisor on Indigenous languages and linguistic rights. Since 2003, she's had sustained and deep experience as an advocate for Indigenous residential school survivors and their descendants. Last year, she was a co-organizer of an educational forum on the legacy of the residential schools and the Holocaust with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And recently, she spoke at Holocaust Education Week in Toronto, Canada, on the legacy of memory and the impact of genocide deniers. Dorota Glowacka is Professor of Humanities at the University of King's College, where she teaches critical theory, Holocaust and genocide studies, and theories of gender and race in the Contemporary Studies program. She's a member of the academic committee at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She lectures internationally on Holocaust and genocide studies in literary, artistic, and philosophical perspectives. She's authored several books, the most recent being From the Other Side, Testimony, Affect, Imagination in 2017. She has also authored many articles and book chapters, including Never Forget, Indigenous Memory of the Genocide and the Holocaust, published in 2019 in the book Holocaust Memory and Racism in the Post-War World. Finally, Wolf Gruner holds the Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and is the Professor of History at the University of Southern California since 2008. He's the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which was founded in 2014. He is a specialist in the history of the Holocaust and in comparative genocide studies. He's the author of 11 books, the co-editor of 4 volumes, and has authored about 60 articles and book chapters. He is also a member of the academic committee of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. And in addition to his work on the Holocaust, Professor Gruner has conducted research on the comparative history of mass violence and resistance to mass violence on a global scale, as well as research on racial and state discrimination against Indigenous populations, especially in Latin America. He authored a book challenging the myth of the liberation of the Indigenous people in the post-colonial 19th century Republic of Bolivia. So after those introductions, please join me in welcoming the presenters. If we were in person, we would be clapping, and Professor Fontaine, I will pass it on to you.
Okay, well, this is a real pleasure. Thank you, Martha, for the wonderful introduction. I'm very honored to be speaking to so many people from around the globe, and I thank the people that have stayed up late to hear us speak this evening. I'm proudly speaking from my home territory, which is now called Winnipeg, but it's the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe people in Canada. Our traditional territory was once covered by prairie grass that spanned over 6,000 kilometers. It is also surrounded by one of the largest watersheds in Canada and one of the largest forest ecosystems in the world. I recognize the plants and the animals and the birds and the fish that find their food sources and homes in this living environment. For us, these are our relatives. The original languages spoken in this region are Ojibwe, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Michif. A treaty that was signed in 1871 took this territory in order to make land available for settler use and ownership. Since that period, Indigenous peoples in this region have suffered immensely. Currently, Indigenous peoples are facing another crisis due to COVID, and I just want to touch on that a little bit because it's so current for Indigenous communities around the globe. More than 476 million Indigenous peoples are currently living in poverty, in isolated or remote communities where healthcare services are difficult to reach. Some have limited capacity to access healthcare services, or some do not exist at all. Indigenous peoples in many regions around the world have a long history of the devastation of epidemics brought by colonizers. COVID-19 presents a new threat to the health and survival of Indigenous peoples around the world. Contributing factors that increase the risk of COVID-19 include malnutrition, undernutrition, poor access to sanitation, lack of clean water, housing, and inadequate medical services. Indigenous peoples are also experiencing widespread stigma and discrimination in healthcare settings, such as stereotyping and lack of quality care. Discrimination is often a deterrence for accessing healthcare, and I just want to bring something that's very current here in Canada. A woman by the name of Joyce Echaquan, who is a 37-year-old Indigenous woman, recently checked herself into a hospital during, at the height of the pandemic in Quebec after experiencing severe stomach pains. She was there alone, partly due to COVID-related restrictions, and she never received the help she required. Echaquan began live streaming on Facebook in her native language that she was worried that the doctors had given her too much morphine, which she was allergic to. And the hospital staff simply said to her, "You made some bad choices, my dear. What are your children going to think seeing you like this?" Echaquan died shortly after posting her video online on September 28th. In addition to the horrific racism that Echaquan experienced prior to her death, access to basic health care during the pandemic in remote communities are also of great concern. Again, as a community close to myself, as of Friday, there's a community 270 kilometers northeast from me, a community called Little Grand Rapids. Roughly a fifth of the population have tested positive for COVID-19 or are in close proximity to those who have tested positive. Overcrowded housing conditions make it almost impossible for people in that community to self-isolate. Access to healthcare services will soon be more difficult when temperatures drop and the lake freezes. The community is currently only accessible by boat or helicopter. So in addition to COVID-19, Indigenous peoples continue to experience violence in a number of areas. And my hope is that this evening, this is a start of a much larger conversation that I hope to continue over the year as we get closer to the date of the conference. I'm hoping that we are able to share the experiences of Indigenous peoples through social media, through Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I now turn to my colleague, Wolf Gruner, to talk about the origins of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. I think now it's working, right? Okay, thank you so much. I also first want to start with acknowledging that the Center for Advanced Genocide Research at USC resides on what was historically the homeland of Indigenous people who were dispossessed of their land, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people. They are the traditional land caretakers of Tovangna today called the Los Angeles Basin and the Channel Islands. I just wanted to re-emphasize what Lorena already said. When we started to think about the conference, we could never imagine how much the kind of second part of the mass violence and its lasting impact would actually come into being and to be so obvious because of the pandemic health crisis all over the world. And just to kind of drive this point home, when we think about, for example, Latin America, in many cases, we are not even aware that people are struggling because there's no kind of system of taking account of who is actually sick, who is passing away from the illness. So there's no kind of access to hospital. So I think this is a huge crisis, which is then toppled by what also recently was in the news, is kind of like the wildfires in the Amazonas region, which are kind of taking away huge territories from the indigenous communities there. So we are in times of crisis, and this is why we thought we would have this conversation today as a starting point and not wait till the conference, which we postponed kind of for a year. And I want to just briefly talk a little bit about how we actually started to come to this conference, and maybe I talk a little bit about myself, because it seems strange that a Holocaust specialist would kind of be among the organizers of such a conference. But when I did my PhD, which was quite a while ago, I always had already an interest in comparative genocide studies. And one personal experience actually really deepened this idea to study comparatively mass violence on different marginalized groups. And this was when I first traveled to Bolivia, and I was kind of coming from Germany, and I had to get a validation of my visa, and so I had to go to the Ministry of Immigration in La Paz. When I arrived there, there was a long line of waiting persons. Most of them were indigenous. And I was getting at the end of the line, just waiting, and somebody in one office surprisingly called me and said, "Come over." And I said, no, I'm at the end of the line. And then he said to me, "They can wait." And this kind of situation had such a kind of personal impact that I started to think really to study the discrimination against indigenous population, which is in the majority Aymara and Quechua people in Bolivia. And I kind of lived for a year studying the archives, and in the end I published this book, Parias de la Patria, which really describes the exclusion and marginalization of the majority of the population in Bolivia, which is indigenous, and which is kind of encompassing all strands of life, or was encompassing all strands of life, from education, military service, healthcare, everything, citizenship. When I moved from Germany to USC, I encountered the possibility to create some comparative research cluster, and in connection with the Shore Foundation, and which was for me really important, because the Shore Foundation has as a mission to give marginalized victims a voice. And when I started the center in 2014, one of my first ideas was to actually record testimonies from Mayan survivors of the Guatemalan genocide, which in connection with a Guatemalan organization actually came into fruition. And today there are more than 500 interviews with Guatemalan, mostly Mayan survivors, 40 of them or 50 of them in their native language, Quiché. So to these kind of efforts by the Shore Foundation, the center kind of accompanied this by an interdisciplinary kind of research effort. And our first attempt was to organize a conference on Guatemala, which was called Genocide and Resistance during the Guatemalan genocide, and in Guatemala, sorry, in 2016. And this was kind of the start of more consistent engagement with indigenous issues regarding mass violence. We featured a documentary about Guatemala by Pamela Yates, which for the first time was not just looking into the past, but she spanned from the struggles during the genocide towards today, the fight, the resistance against the denial of the genocide and mass violence against the Mayan communities in Guatemala. And the conference then was kind of in the back of my head. I always thought there should be such a conference, but there was also another personal encounter which I had, which kind of really pushed forward that we need to do and bring together indigenous scholars on this topic. And this was when I was at a conference in Minnesota. And this was a conference on Holocaust and genocide studies, where I tried to make a case, and I was not the only one, to really include the history of Native communities when we think about genocides. And there afterwards, we had a kind of a discussion, and one of the student workers came to me and thanked me. And I said, you should not thank me. I mean, I didn't do anything. And then she started crying and revealed that she was growing up on a reservation and was still heavily impacted by the mass violence of the past until today. And this is why the conference, in a way, kind of tries to bridge historical events with how they impact today's life of indigenous communities, either in the Americas, but we also wanted to look into the Pacific regions. And part of this is also to really resituate in a way comparative genocide studies, which tend to kind of exclude the mass violence against indigenous communities. And here I want to hand over to our third co-organizer, Dorota Glowacka.
Thank you very much, Wolf. And I'm really honored to be part of this conversation and of this important conference. I'm joining you from Halifax, Chibouctouc, Nova Scotia, Canada, and to the Mi'kmaq, the indigenous people who have lived here for at least 10,000 years. This city has always been known as Chibouctouc, which means great water in Mi'kmaq. It was renamed Halifax and became the colonial capital of the region in 1749. So I would like to acknowledge that Chibouctouc, and thus my university, where I'm speaking today, is located in Mi'kmaqi, the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship between the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples and the British Crown, the first of which was signed in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, so these were not land treaties, and Nova Scotia is not a treaty land. Instead, these treaties recognized the indigenous title to the land and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between colonial settlers and the First Nations in the area. And these are the rules that we are all obligated to honor. I should add that I'm an immigrant to Canada, but having benefited from Canada's colonial history, I am a member of the settler colonial population. And the colonial history of Nova Scotia was anything but peaceful. This is coastal area, and for the Mi'kmaq, it was a moose hunting and fishing territory. From the colonial point of view, it was rich in natural resources. It was also strategically located, so it became a focal point of the rivalry between France and England for the control of North America, which had disastrous consequences for the Mi'kmaq, who were defending the territory from the British settlers, and as a result were decimated by war, diseases, and hunger, having been cut off from the sources of livelihood. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of Mi'kmaq scholars, especially Daniel Paul, who is scheduled to present at this conference next year in bringing this history to light. And in his book, We Were Not Savages, Daniel Paul compares mass violence against the Mi'kmaq to the Holocaust, Nazi Germany's genocide of the European Jews. And similar comparisons between the Holocaust and settler colonial violence in North America have often been made by Indigenous scholars, writers, and activists, especially in the 1990s, in an attempt to draw attention to this bloody but, unlike the Holocaust, little known history. So this brings me to what, in my view, and what Wolf already talked about, will be one of the central issues of this conference, how to situate mass violence against Indigenous peoples within the discourse of genocide in comparison to other instances of mass atrocities that have been now officially recognized as genocide. And when I say officially recognized, I mean they have been deemed as falling under the terms of the 1948 United Nations Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And according to this document, genocide means a specific acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So according to official national histories of settler colonial states, there was no premeditated genocidal intent to destroy Indigenous populations. According to Indigenous scholars, however, this is a colonial understanding of intent. And considering that acts that constitute genocide, according to the convention, include not only physical killing, but also causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, mass violence against Indigenous peoples and certainly against the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, including the destruction of Indigenous cultures and languages, must be recognized as genocide. On the other hand, what the presentations by the conference participants will likely make clear, there are many elements of that violent history that simply cannot be encompassed by the UN definition, which, and this only reveals the limitations of the current legal concept of genocide. So according to the aims of this conference, we must respect, listen to, support, and recognize as legitimate the claims to genocide by groups who perceive themselves as having been targeted by genocidal violence, the claim that was recognized, honored, and widely documented in the case of the genocide of European Jews. So if I can say so, on this ground, as a daughter of a Holocaust survivor myself, I feel an affinity with Lorena, Dr. Fontaine, and her family history of surviving Indian residential schools. Thanks. I think it's over to Martha. Thank you.
Professor Fontaine, I think you were going to continue.
Yes. So I'm going to talk about some of the knowledge gaps and the importance of this conference. And I wanted to pick up a bit on what Dorota had just mentioned, the relationship that her and I have developed over the years was the result of a conference that occurred in Winnipeg, where I am now, quite a few years ago. It was a conference on genocide. And I remember telling the audience that there was at one point when I was working on residential school claims that I started looking at the impact on my family situation. And I didn't realize at that, during that period of my life that the legacy of cultural genocide and the residential schools had impacted my generation. And so I went looking for literature that supported this history, but also to look at how the legacy was impacting people of my generation. And I found that there was no literature So I had to go looking for other communities that had experienced cultural genocide to find out how it was impacting those communities. And I found quite a few material on children of Holocaust survivors. I started reading the books and I identified with a lot of the experiences, the shame, the silent shame that a lot of families were experiencing, the cultural shame, that legacy that was passed on through the generations. And so I don't want to necessarily talk about the, the research gaps and the importance for this conference, but to emphasize, I think, the importance of interdisciplinary approaches to look at mass violence on Indigenous peoples, because there's still quite a bit of research that requires interdisciplinary approaches. But I also think that the relationships that are developed in conducting research in this way will result in key relationships. The conference is a prime example of that. I would probably not be sitting here today if it was not for my relationship with Dorota and her bringing me into, a new group of scholars that do research in this field. I met Wolf at a conference at Washington University quite a few years ago, and these discussions kind of flourished from the ability for us to gather. So I'm really looking forward to the conference and bringing people from different perspectives and different disciplines to shed light on the mass violence that Indigenous peoples experience. And I lastly just want to share one story that Indigenous peoples, it was sort of at the height of 2000 when Indigenous peoples were filing residential school claims against the churches and the federal government. And the claims were primarily established around the sexual and physical abuse that Indigenous peoples were experiencing. And when I was going out into the communities, I kept hearing genocide and cultural genocide. And this was the first time that I was hearing the term used in remote communities and across the country. And what I was told by, I would say 95% of the 10,000 claims that were filed against the federal government and the churches was that our elders were concerned about the fact that children were no longer speaking their language, were no longer practicing their culture, were no longer living on the land, and they were afraid that these land relationships were disintegrating. And they were looking to the future. They wanted children to be able to access their language and culture in schools. They wanted traditional practices to become alive again so that children were reconnected to relationships on the land. And they also wanted the community to know that a lot of these traditional practices and teachings were no longer being shared, not only because of what the government was doing in Indigenous communities, but the fact that Indigenous peoples have been repeatedly told that our knowledge has no longer any value, that it is not academic, and that it is not scientific. And the Indigenous peoples in these regions knew that that wasn't the case, and they didn't want so much reparations in these fields, but for Indigenous communities to be able to revitalize their language and culture, and to see that the children were practicing traditional knowledge, had access to traditional knowledge in Indigenous communities. There's a lot of research that has to occur in these areas, but I think most importantly that We have dedicated scholars and academic communities that can bring voice to the violence that Indigenous peoples are experiencing. And conferences like these, I think, are key to raise attention to these important issues.
Yeah, thank you, Lorena. And I just wanted also to kind of repeat this point. I think it is so much about knowledge, and also I think especially for Western academics to kind of reinvent their approach or revise their approach, because a lot of the kind of mass violence is kind of in a way covered up by very interesting or very strange kind of assumptions that, for example, Indigenous people succumb to diseases. And we see today with the pandemic how important like healthcare and certain structures are. If they are not in place, if they are not, if there's not the ability to counter these diseases, then they are even more deadly. And in many cases in the indigenous communities, these infrastructures were destroyed by the colonizers. So there, we need to really revise this approach, how we see the mass violence itself, and also the effects on these communities. And we can only do this, and as Lorena said, with indigenous scholars. And so we are really, and this is a little bit of a teaser for the conference, we are really fortunate to have a large variety of indigenous scholars who will participate, knowledge holders, for example, from the, and I hope I don't mispronounce this, from the Anishinaabe Métis, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, the Diné, the indigenous people from the Arctic Circle, from Hawaii, from Mexico, like Mixtec, Triqui, and Zapotec, Kichwa, Maori, Mapuche, Tuelche, Quiche, Maya Quiche, Mi'kmaq, Mohawk, Pilaga, Potu, Watumi, and Ojibwe, Rinapi and Lenape, Sac and Meskwaki, and Tolton, Tlingit, and some more. So just to give you a sense of how the kind of the response to our call for papers was overwhelming, and we are really fortunate that all these geographies we wanted to present, like the Americas, North America, but also Latin America with different countries, and the Pacific regions, including Hawaii, Australia, and New Zealand, will be kind of represented by scholars in our conference. And Lorena already made an important point that, which is also part of the mission of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, is that innovative research can only be kind of come out of interdisciplinarity. And at this conference, we will have 23 different academic disciplines presented. So this is not a history conference. We have English, heritage studies, indigenous sociology, Latinx and Latin American studies, linguistics, Native American studies, public health, and women and gender studies, and so many more. I don't want to kind of put them all out, but just that you get an idea what we are aiming at and what we are preparing for at the conference. And the problem why we had to postpone the conference was, as you know, was the COVID crisis, which also made things more difficult for us as a host, because we are always trying to build connections and find kind of co-sponsors for our conference. And right now we are happy to have the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program at the University of Arizona, the USC Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute, and the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West as co-sponsors. The problem is that our main co-sponsor, the University of Melbourne, actually, because of the health crisis and financial problems, had to kind of give up their co-sponsorship. So we are still looking for help in this regard, but we are already very happy that we have these co-sponsors. And at the end, I would just want to say that we are not having only an academic kind of discussion, which I want to emphasize that we really will have a conference which is heavily focused on the discussion. So this is not just to present some papers, but we have ample time allocated, which is equal time for presentation and discussion of each paper to really get a deep interdisciplinary conversation about these really important and very current topics during the conference. And this is all, this whole program is then kind of in a way complemented by some kind of programming, which includes music presentations, documentary film screenings. We will have a community event with Indigenous elders. So we are trying to include community and the wider public into this scholarly conference. And to get you some ideas what will be discussed at the conference, I hand over to Dorota.
Thank you, Wolf. So a few words about the academic program of the conference. I will start with the keynote. The keynote for the conference will be Dr. Kim Tolber, who is Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Environment in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, Canada. And Dr. Tolber is a member of the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate Nation, descended from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma. So the main part of the conference will be panels on many subjects, including but not limited to land rights and land claims, legal and theoretical perspectives, genocide denial versus memory and memorialization, including representations in literature and art, the impact of settler colonial mass violence on climate and the environment, as well as contemporary environmental racism, impact of forced migrations and displacement, the legacies of residential schools, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as well as resilience, political resurgence, and reclamation and restoration of Indigenous cultures. And this will include a panel on repatriation of human remains, also on education and language rights. And we will also have a UNESCO roundtable on cultural genocide and linguicide, the destruction of Indigenous languages. So, as I said before, the events of mass violence against Indigenous peoples span over 500 years. And Indigenous Peoples Day is still known in some states in the US as Columbus Day. Yet it is crucial, and Lorena and Wolf already spoke to that, that we recognize that the genocidal aftermath of those past violent histories is very present in the contemporary reality of settler colonial state, and that we have to acknowledge the continuity between the past and the present. And because of this continuity, and I'm speaking about Canada because this is where I live, Indigenous scholars in Canada regard Canada to be a colonial, not a post-colonial country. Just for instance, the so-called doctrine of discovery that was the basis of the expropriation of Indigenous lands from the 16th century is still entrenched in Canadian law. And Canadian First Nations are not being recognized as legally sovereign nations. But in Canada, following the 2015 report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Commission's 94 calls to action, and then in 2019, the report of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and this inquiry's calls for justice. Thanks to those documents, these violent histories and their aftermath are now slowly becoming known. So one hopes that this knowledge will lead to a shift in settler colonial perceptions of both at least Canadian history and Canadian reality in the present. But this does not change the fact that literally, as Lorena already spoke about, not a day goes by that we hear about yet another case of Indigenous rights being violated and Indigenous lives being lost, and the justice system being systematically stacked against Indigenous victims of violence and Indigenous claimants. And just to give you an example, in Canada, regarding the rates of incarceration for Indigenous individuals in this country, currently more than 30% of 30 of inmates in Canadian prisons are Indigenous, even though Indigenous people make up not even 5% of the country's population. So in Nova Scotia, just less than 2 weeks ago, we saw violent clashes between the Mi'kmaq fishermen who were trying to exercise their rights to fish for a moderate livelihood, and that right is now constitutionally guaranteed. Clashing with the non-native fishermen who argue that this is unfair competition for resources and a threat to resource sustainability. Lorena talked about the tragic death of Joyce Ekhan from Quebec. When we watch these current events and then we try to judge them, it is crucial to remember that the roots of these contemporary conflicts reach back several hundred years. So I've mostly talked about Canadian history and its disastrous legacies because, again, I think I should look at what's in my own backyard, so to speak. But as we will hear at the conference, these issues are similar across the geographies of settler colonialism. So at least now we do hear about these events, and some of us, including members of the settler colonial population, like myself and Wolf, want to hear about them. And in that sense, we are hoping that this conference will not only be an academic event, but a contribution to, a concrete contribution to addressing these violent histories and to trying to right this, I think, most grievous historical wrong. Thanks. And
thank you so much to the organizers. I'm going to unmute you now, all of you, so that you are available to answer questions. So a reminder to attendees, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can type them in the chat. My colleague Badema Pitic is going to help with fielding the questions for the panelists. And one question that we have gotten in the chat is, when is the conference and how can I find out more about it? So the conference is currently scheduled for October 9th to 13th of 2021. The conference website is not yet posted, but I did put a link in the chat, which you'll also get by email, so don't feel like you've got to scroll through the chat, to sign up to get conference updates. And we really are hoping to, as Professor Fontaine said, to facilitate and foster a conversation in the year to come on Twitter, on Instagram, on maybe little videos or interviews with panelists and with Indigenous knowledge holders. So we really hope that you will be a part of this conversation that is launching with this event. So let's see. So someone is asking whether there's a hashtag. We don't have a hashtag yet, but we will, and we'll include it in the event email that will go out with this video. So if you want to share this conversation with people and tweet about it, we will include the hashtag in that email. She asks, will there be an effort to engage school teachers with tools for improving how children and youth learn about Indigenous history? So does any of the panelists want to answer that? I know there is a paper at the conference about education as resistance, as a form of resistance. Does anyone want to add to that?
Well, I'll just say that I think that's a really important point, because oftentimes we go to these conferences and we want to have some kind of impact, not only on the scholarly community, but also in education generally on these issues. So I think including, you know, some discussion on how the panelists' papers and the discussions that occur over the course of the conference can whittle down to how the material can be used for children, I think is key, and something that I think we should talk about. Wolf or Dorota, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Dorota, do you want to?
I mean, I thoroughly agree. And this is my experience from Holocaust conferences and participating in, and again, I constantly think in comparative terms, but that's what we try to do. For example, having a kind of workshop for high school teachers, just so that that knowledge is meaningfully disseminated. Because again, and that's what I said, that for me, this must not be a kind of academic exercise. This would totally miss the point of why we are doing this.
Maybe I add, I think it is also what we want to do with this conference is to really kind of appeal to Indigenous knowledge holders, to scholars, to really investigate the past, because what I often encountered is, for example, in my studies in Bolivia, is that the indigenous community is so taken by the current events and problems they have that they don't often have so much interest. But for it's exactly the point of education, we need this knowledge. And when I moved to the United States, to California, my children were educated in the US school system. They learned about the good sides of the mission, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Yeah, so we need this knowledge to bring this in the regular curriculum, and there needs to be a balance. And this is also why I think the conference is so important, because on the one hand, I appreciate that there's a lot of kind of education about the Holocaust, but there is this total imbalance in the school system not to talk about the Native communities. And I think this needs to change dramatically.
Thank you, Wolf. I think one other thing I would add to that is that we've talked a lot about pointing at the legacy and the lasting impact of mass violence. And the conference will concretely explore some of those episodes of mass violence across the geographic contexts and cultural contexts that Wolf was mentioning earlier, but is also really interested in looking at the dynamics and exploring the dynamics of resilience, of resistance, of Indigenous activism, of efforts to create lasting change. So that's another important dimension of the conference that I wanted to mention. Let's see. Someone asked in the Q&A feature if there's going to be a presentation by Indigenous peoples themselves of testimonies.
Mm.
Anybody want to answer? Any of the panelists want to answer that? I mean, the cultural event, the community event that we're planning with the Indigenous elders, which will be the event that launches the conference, is, as it's being planned, an opportunity for an intercultural dialogue about their experiences and as those experiences relate to the themes of the conference. So I think that's one opportunity. And as Wolf mentioned, about half of the participants at the conference are Indigenous knowledge holders and scholars. And we certainly hope, I can see again in the chat, names of some of the community activists and engaged people who are working to make Indigenous lives better from within their own communities. So I imagine there will be lots of spaces for sharing around that.
Yeah, and also probably since we the Center for Advanced Genocide Research is at the Shoah Foundation, we will probably also present the Indigenous voices we have in the visual history archive of the Shoah Foundation, specifically from Mayan survivors. So I think this can be also be kind of a vehicle to kind of start a conversation about Indigenous testimony in general.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe this is also another good point is that we do have testimony in various organizations around the world from Indigenous peoples. Here in Canada, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that created a national center for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or Truth and Reconciliation. And the center is actually here in Winnipeg, Canada, at the University of Manitoba. And there's 6,700 testimonies by Indigenous peoples that I think it's really underutilized in research. And maybe this would be an opportunity for us to showcase some of the testimony at the center. So very good point.
And maybe to add to this, the Shaw Foundation is always kind of interested in integrating additional kind of voices. And the big advantage is since we talked about education, that the Visual History Archive is currently accessible in 150 universities worldwide. So an integration of Indigenous voices or more Indigenous voices into the archive would then be also create much more access and work with this, not just in research, but also in teaching at the kind of university level.
All right, thank you so much. So it's 5 o'clock. We have a few more questions in the chat about Ben Madley's book, An American Genocide, and whether we might consider including his work as part of the conference, whether the conference will include sessions about the prevalence of Indigenous mascots and monuments that present an affront to Native peoples, and also a question about whether the conference will include trainings for working with digital archives in ways that honor and respect Indigenous experiences and that are mindful to not re-traumatize Indigenous survivors. We're so grateful for these questions, some of which we have considered in the planning of the conference and some of which are provocative suggestions for us to include in our future planning. And we hope that we can stay involved in this discussion and engaged in this discussion in the months ahead. As I said, we'll be sharing a recording with all the attendees, and we want to thank our panelists again. Any final words from our panelists?
I start, and I thank everybody for staying even for the Q&A. I hope this conversation generated interest for the upcoming conference. I hope you also join us when we have other maybe mini events over the course of the next year. And please approach us with any kind of ideas or comments or anything. We want to create, we want to use the opportunity to create a network between Indigenous knowledge holders and also non-Indigenous scholars, which we think is necessary to really lift these kind of issues up.
And it already seems apparent that this conference, as Lorena mentioned, will be the opening of a discussion, and some ideas of what may yet to come in the future kind of emerge from that conference is already percolating. So again, we don't know what might follow, but definitely there will be other developments stemming from it.
Professor Fontaine?
Well, I would just like to thank everybody for joining us today. It really warmed my heart to see how many people stayed up late in Europe. There's some people from Australia, so it felt really good to be part of this global community. And I hope that you'll continue to join in the conversation over the year prior to the conference.
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who attended. We look forward to this conversation continuing. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.